To start the conversation with us here tonight, joining us once again on the program, two gentlemen who've been here before. We appreciate you being back. Thomas Harvey from Arch City Defenders and John Ammon, St. Louis University Law School, also the supervisor of the litigation clinic. When I said that some folks are ready to move on, I'm talking about well-meaning individuals who also may live in Ferguson, want to work for change, but they're maybe tired of talking about this publicly. They're kind of tired, and there's a certain, just a certain exhaustion that they feel when you just use the word Ferguson, which we know means more than the city limits of Ferguson itself. So help us set the stage here a little bit. Not everyone's had time to read all 106 pages. How bad is it? How did it read when you saw it?
Well, it confirms what our clients have been telling us all along, which is this isn't about public safety, it's about the money, and they're being pulled over because they're black and they're being exploited, and it has destroyed the trust between city government, police, courts acting in unison to hurt a certain segment of the population, and that community is distrustful of the government as a result of it. And the DOJ report went into things in more detail than other reports, but John Ammon and I and the SLU Law Clinics have been doing work for years on this, as well as other members of the community. And more importantly, for folks impacted by these policies, this is nothing new. It's for folks who haven't set foot in those courts and haven't been stopped by the police in the region that this is new information.
We have a quote from the report here. It says, when police and courts treat people unfairly, unlawfully, or disrespectfully, law enforcement loses legitimacy in the eyes of those who have experienced or even observed the unjust conduct. This is not just, we saw folks who were there giving their stories to the interviewers, the investigators. This report is not just anecdotal or even personal stories. There was data behind this to back up what you're saying as well, correct?
Absolutely.
Right. And Casey, the DOJ report also made a point to say that the practices in Ferguson have made the community less safe. So not only is it abusive and oppressive to the people who, African Americans primarily, people who have to line up in the cold and go to municipal court on nights like tonight and wait to have their tickets heard, that in addition to that oppression, we don't gain anything with public safety. It's hurting public safety to have this system.
Of course, some would say you don't have to line up and go to court if you don't speed. What did this report say to that? In fact, it said the officers, largely, there was a sentiment that people felt that this was a problem that could be attributed to a lack of personal responsibility on behalf of those who found themselves as defendants.
Right. What the report is able to get into that the other previous reports have not been able to get into is the attitudes of the people who run those institutions. So they have emails, they have quotes, they have interviews from people who are talking to the Department of Justice about allegations of racial profiling, and whose response is an incredibly paternalistic, racist response, which is, how else will we teach these people lessons unless we assess fines, unless we can threaten jail? So for every one person who will publicly say that to the DOJ, imagine how many more there are who are thinking that and who are exchanging private emails off of their government issued email address. So the report is shocking, I think, to me, only in the sense that they find evidence from the very people who run the institutions. You could always find people standing outside these courts who would tell anybody in the world who cared to listen to them what was going on. You could always find the Attorney General's report showing that there's a disparity in stops in Ferguson and our entire region. And you could always find on the budgets, on the websites, their budgets showing that these are the second highest or third highest source of revenue in the town. But what we haven't been able to find before the DOJ's report was admissions by the individuals running these courts and institutions that they are individually racist actors within this system.
Along those lines, something that was going around Twitter this week from the website redstate.com, which is probably self-explanatory in its title, but it's a conservative blog, conservative website. The gentleman who wrote this article said, I intentionally disregarded all commentary regarding what the DOJ investigators reported. He basically just assumed what they said didn't matter. He could have discounted what the individual said. He said, even if you read only the parts of the Ferguson DOJ report that come directly from the files of the FPD, which is to say that would put them presumably in the most favorable light, the report paints an incredibly damning picture of the Ferguson Police Department. No conservative on earth should feel comfortable with what it had to say.
Exactly right. And Casey, on the personal responsibility issue, how many times in the last few weeks have we read stories where a municipality has not followed the law? How many cities in St. Louis County have failed to give the state auditor their report about how much traffic fines they've collected and whether they're violating the 30% of revenue that's in the state law? How many communities were late or have failed to file the report with the Missouri Attorney General about racial profiling? So if our attitude's going to be follow the law, that's got to work for the municipalities too, and it hasn't. And the problem is that we have so many municipalities, and some of them are not capable of keeping up. We heard from the mayor of Wellston this week. He said, I don't have time to respond to Sunshine Act request, to Freedom of Information Act request. And I sympathize with the police chief in Wellston. That should not be his job, but Wellston doesn't have the capacity to operate as a municipality and respond to the obligations it has at the state and federal level.
So do our municipal courts have the capacity to live up to the standards that we're going to get into in terms of changes and recommendations? Do they have, because I think we've said on previous shows, this is not just a Ferguson problem. Would you find these, if the DOJ investigated other municipalities, what would they find? Something similar?
Broadly similar, right? I mean, it would be a question of degree, but you would see constitutional violations, you would see policies and practices that disproportionately impact African Americans and poor people in our region, and you would see a general attitude within the courts that display a disregard for those folks. So would you find individual emails? I don't have any idea. But if you just looked at those numbers and you asked people on any night in this town, in any court in this town, how they feel about the courts, they would tell you essentially the same thing that you see in that report. And the answer for, the question now when we talk about reforms, we need to stop talking about a reform. We need to shift this whole narrative to say, why should these courts continue to exist? Abolition should be our starting point instead of nibbling around the edges and trying to reform slightly. The Missouri Supreme Court now has asserted very clearly that they have the authority to take over these courts. They're limiting their action right now to Ferguson's municipal court, but there's obviously no reason why they couldn't extend their actions to any other municipal court in this region.
So then St. Louis County would take care of these things just as a matter of point here. What would you suggest?
Well, there are a variety of proposals. Brendan Roediger at St. Louis University School of Law had proposed a revision to state law that would move all the courts to the associate circuit court level and then allow for the individual municipalities to contract with the 4 satellite courts that we have in our region and then just pay for those courts. Right now, the numbers suggest that the municipal courts profit $52 million a year from these courts, and Better Together's report shows that it costs about $15 million a year to operate those courts when they pay individual judges and prosecutors. If they pooled that money and made a full-time professional court in those 4 satellite courts, you could do it for a lot less than $15 million a year.
So if I'm living in, I'll just pick Kirkwood, and we're running a pretty tight ship, I don't know what the court is like there, but do they lose their court too? How does this affect the broader population if we take on such a, sounds like almost like a moonshot kind of goal here?
Well, I mean, to address the moonshot thing, this is, from what we've seen in that report, in the DOJ's report, that's what we need to be thinking about, right? You couldn't be any more clear that we've got a major problem and then we need to change it. So if all you're going to do is if all it takes is the creation of 4 regional courts, let's do it. Kirkwood there's no reason, there's nothing under the law that says Kirkwood has to have its own municipal court, or Jennings does, or Pine Lawn does. Create 4 regional courts, make them professional full-time courts, staff them up, and then you would at least create the environment in which people can have the benefit of a professional court. And you isolate it to 4 different places that you have to go if you're a defendant in one of these courts. And frankly, as folks who are involved in sort of a watchdog role, it's easier for us to see what's going on in those courts too if there's only 4 places we have to go as opposed to 81.
And when you say professional, people may not realize the judges and prosecutors aren't always full-time. In fact, I think that in the report, or perhaps it was the white paper from Arch City that talked about a part-time prosecutor or a part-time judge can actually make more money than a full-time public defender in some situations.
That happens. And Casey, if I can make a point, it's great that we're talking about reforms now. Ferguson, for example, has eliminated failure to appear fines because we learned that from the DOJ report that was the #1 offense in Ferguson. So you talk about public safety. The #1 crime in Ferguson was not showing up for court. Well, how does that help public safety? But the point is,
Of course, they
Ferguson,
were hard to show up for, according to the report, in some instances where you
Right.
couldn't bring your children in or other things that the report outlined.
some cities like Ferguson have repealed fees that were illegal. A warrant recall fee, a warrant letter fee, things that they were charging for, they've now repealed. Great step. And there's several cities in St. Louis County that were charging those illegal fees. If they wipe them out now, that's great. But here's the problem. They've been charging those fees for years. Pay the money back. We have young black men that society criticizes. Why don't you get a job? Why don't you go to school? You know why? Because some municipalities in St. Louis County took hundreds of dollars out of his pocket illegally. Some of these communities have stolen money from young black men in our community by adding fees on to their traffic cases. And we've got some litigation going now, and we're asking the courts to say, tell them to give the money back. That's the least they can do.
Real quickly, you were in Ferguson court tonight, John.
Right.
We have a new judge there. The Missouri Supreme Court put in a professional judge. Any changes, any different atmosphere?
Well, Judge Richter's a Court of Appeals judge. He's got a lot of experience, and he'll be very thoughtful about the reforms, and it's going to take him some time to get deep into the Ferguson system and see how it works. So we have hope that Judge Richter will come out of this and say, here's what needs to change in Ferguson. And Judge Richter helps train municipal judges throughout the state. So he's going to have a statewide impact. He's going to say, we're going to do this in Ferguson, and the rest of you cities should do this too. The thing that hasn't changed, that had not changed for tonight, Casey, is the makeup of the people in the courtroom. I counted about 80 people in court at 6:30 tonight. 78 of them were African American. Judge Richter can't fix that because those cases are in the pipeline. The police are writing the tickets. Yes, there are white people who get tickets and maybe hire a lawyer, but the people who can't afford a lawyer, the people who have to come to court to take care of their tickets, are hardworking African Americans from our community. And Judge Richter couldn't fix that tonight, and it's going to take a long time to fix that because of the cases in the pipeline and because of the problems we have with policing.